Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Richard Arjun Kaul, and welcome to Nine. Today is September the 1st, 2015, and I'm talking to you from New York City in New York. Senator Bob Menendez, who's a New Jersey-based senator, but also an American Cuban, was arrested back in April of 2015 on charges of political corruption. Within the allegations, he was charged with using his political office for financial gain and to benefit his political donors. Well, he must have had some kind of an epiphany, because now, in conjunction with Cory Booker, who's another New Jersey-based politician, they're asking for changes to the political donation system. So political reform, campaign reform as it's been called. And what they're essentially saying is that companies and corporations that donate monies to political parties should disclose how much money they're giving to the various political parties. Because at the moment there's an opacity to the system, and it's impossible for people to find out who's given what, where, when and how. And all of these elements of non-transparency have led to a very corrupt political system, of which Mr. Menendez was a part. But now, because he's on the outside, and to his credit, he's looking to change it. I've talked about political corruption in the American political system on a number of occasions. And I think one of the problems that's occurred in the United States is that people have entered politics as a career, which it was never meant to be. It was meant to be a part of an individual's civic duty, that they would contribute a part of their time to political questions, to social issues, to economic issues, but then they would retire back to their business, their trade, or their profession. What was not intended was that they would leave college, university, or their business and decide to become a career politician, which is what the majority of politicians in Washington, D.C. are. So, in my opinion, I think what should happen is that there should be strict term limits imposed on people that occupy political positions. It should be 4 years, and after which they should not be allowed to re-enter the political arena. One of the other things I've also talked about is the favours that some politicians procure once they've left political office from various companies and businesses and interests. And I've also suggested that there should be a 2-year period after which they've left political office in which they're prohibited from taking any type of employment from any companies or businesses or industries that they've directly dealt with whilst in political office. I think that this would negate the impact of influence that businesses, outside entities, corporations would have on the political system. Because ultimately, when you have a system that doesn't work, a political system that doesn't work, it's the citizens of the state or the citizens of the country that end up being victimized. And I think there's been so many instances within the last 5 to 10 years of politicians getting caught up in political corruption that I think the American people are now really calling for change. And I think Senator Bob Menendez is responding. He's an interesting character as well. He's taken a very clear position against President Barack Obama with regards to the Iranian deal, and I've talked about that before. Barack Obama, through John Kerry, signed a deal with the Iranians allowing them access to nuclear technology, which I think is a sensible move because it distributes power in a more even way. Menendez has opposed that deal. He's also opposed Obama's cordial relations that have occurred now with Cuba, because he's an American Cuban and he left Cuba in the his family left in the 1950s, taking a very anti-Castro stance. And Bob Menendez has maintained that position throughout his political career. And so he sees Obama's moves to re-engage with Cuba as an insult to him and all Cuban Americans that left Cuba. So again, I think that what President Obama has done with Cuba, I think again is I think it's a sensible move, and I think it's going to lower the tempo of conflict that's occurred between Cuba and America for almost 4 decades. Now, the healthcare sector in America has gotten a lot of attention nationally and internationally since the introduction of the Affordable Health Care Act. Barack Obama's key piece legislation to bring down the costs of healthcare in America, which are 18% of the gross domestic product, are, for the most part, well intended. There are some pieces of the legislation that I think are faulty and I think were politically engineered, and specifically the failure to address medical malpractice reform. However, the state of New Jersey was reported recently as having been prosecuted by the federal authorities for committing healthcare fraud. And the story is that the state of New Jersey improperly billed Medicaid, which is one of the federally funded health programs, for home health services which allegedly were never provided. Now, it doesn't come as any surprise to me, and probably to a lot of other people, that it happens to be New Jersey, under the tutelage of Governor Chris Christie, when these offences occurred. And the amount that the federal authorities are alleging were misbilled is $350 million. So I find it quite amusing that here we are trying to engineer a more efficient healthcare system, and we have a governor of a state with a long history of corruption continuing to fraudulently send in bills to the federal authorities. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that case. I'm sure the state government's going to have to pay. Now, there's a very famous neurologist called Dr. Oliver Sacks, who passed away 2 days ago, and was actually a British neurologist. He went to university in Oxford and then went to medical school in London, and immigrated initially to Canada and then came to the States in the 1960s. And he was located initially in California and then moved to New York, which is where he ended his days. But a key part of his work was with regards to the use of hallucinogenic substances for the treatment of anxiety and depressive disorders. And Dr. Sacks wrote and lectured extensively about how these substances could open up channels of communication and allow people with mental disorders and inabilities to communicate. And in fact, the film Awakenings with Robin Williams was based around the story and the work of Dr. Oliver Sacks. It's interesting that his work and the timing of his death also coincides with the FDA plans to move ahead to give authorization for MDMA, which is the technical term for ecstasy. It's a methylene dioxymethamphetamine. And they've given authorization for MDMA trials for the treatment of anxiety and depression. Now, MDMA, ecstasy, when it was first synthesized in the 1920s by a Swiss company called Hoffmann-La-Roche, was legal. And it only became illegal in the 1980s when it started to be used in what's referred to as the rave or the club culture. But prior to that, there was a psychologist by the name of Alexander Shulgin, who again was based in San Francisco, and he was using it for counseling for his patients. He would counsel couples that were having difficulty with their marital relations, and at the start of the session he would give them a measured dose of MDMA, and found that their abilities to empathize with each other were improved. And according to Dr. Shulgin, he felt that MDMA was a very useful therapeutic tool, which I think is what the FDA has realized and is now moving ahead with trials to bring it back into the medical mainstream. Some Israeli soldiers in the West Bank, and there were some pictures that were shown on some of the media websites of an Israeli soldier with his arm around an 11-year-old Palestinian boy. Now, the conflict in the Middle East has been going on in one form or the other for many centuries. I mean, you can trace it back to the Crusaders. But the modern day cauldron is really is based around Palestine and the part of the Middle East that was occupied by Palestinians, but then with the Balfour Declaration of the 1920s, the Palestinians were relocated and European Jews were given a homeland. Now, this conflict has been going on since then, and it seems to have no real solution. You've got Palestinians who are refusing to move on their negotiation of their positions, and you've got the Israelis who are saying that the land is theirs. If you go back far enough in history, back into the biblical days, it was actually Israelis that occupied the land. But the interesting thing is that actually they're all the same people. I mean, we call them Palestinians, and we call them Israelis, and we call them Arabs, but they're all racially from the same group of people. And the divisions that we see today in terms of nations, in terms of supposed racial separations, are really arbitrary. And I think there have been concerted efforts by many governments to bring peace to this part of the world, because it creates instability globally, and it's been talked about as being a potential point of a third world war. And that's why I think what President Obama has done with Iran is very good. I think it's leveled the playing field in that region. So Iran has nuclear capabilities. Israel has nuclear capabilities. It leads to an equalization of power, which leads to greater stability, which I think may be the beginning of the end of the Middle Eastern conflict. We'll see. Now, President Obama has been in the news a lot lately, more so than the previous couple of years, and I think he's in his last term, so now I think he really is coming into his own. He doesn't feel any restraints, he doesn't feel as if he has to kowtow to anyone, because there's really no other office that he plans on getting elected to. So the second term, interestingly, of most US presidencies are when you see the presidents or the individuals occupying that office really doing what they said they were going to do, and really being true to who they are and to what they're about. And he was in the news recently with regards to Guantanamo Bay. Now, Guantanamo Bay is a piece of land on the island of Cuba, interestingly, that was set up during the Gulf War to imprison so-called terrorists, people who were taking a position against America and American interests. Now, in my opinion, Guantanamo Bay is nothing more than a concentration camp, and it's a place where people were rounded up, brought to, and were denied access to any form of justice. They were also subjected to torture and interrogation tactics that certain members of the American political system tried to mollify by using bureaucratic terms. But the truth of the matter is that people were kept in horrific conditions, subjected to horrific treatments and tortures, and denied access to any form of justice. And I think when Barack Obama was running for the presidency, one of his promises was he was going to close Camp X, as it's called. And I think now he's beginning to put that promise into place. And so all of the individuals that are contained within Camp X will either be repatriated to their own country or to countries that will accept them, or they will be afforded the opportunity to bring their case into a court, whether it's an American court or it's the International Court in The Hague. But I think that that's a very significant step forward by the President, and I think it's to his credit that he's had the courage to now come out and do what he said he was going to do. And before I finish, there was one story which is both a national and an international story. And it's about human trafficking. And it's about the human trafficking for the purposes of serving the sex industry. Now, when people read or see documentaries about this social epidemic, they immediately think it only applies to what are referred to as third world countries. But in fact, it's a major issue now in both the United States and parts of the European Union. And women don't willingly go into prostitution. Women don't willingly get themselves abducted and sent off to different countries to perform sexual acts. It always comes from a position of economic deprivation. So wherever one goes in the world and you encounter severe economic deprivation, that's where you're going to find this social plague more frequently. And it's interesting that it's now becoming a big issue in America because of the division of wealth. The fact that 99% of the wealth is held by 1% of the population, and the other 99% of the population have 1% of the wealth. So there's a huge disparity between the haves and the have-nots. The middle class, which a lot of politicians have been talking about, Bernie Sanders being one of them, or the size of the middle class, I should say, has significantly shrunken. If you compare it to the 1950s, the middle class occupied 70% of the American population. It now occupies between 10 to 12%. It's shrunken by almost 60%. And this imbalance, this economic imbalance that now has America in its grip, is one of the main, or is the main cause, I would say, for the increased incidence of human trafficking for the purposes of prostitution and the sex industry in America. So, I think that the solution here is economic in nature, and it's about making sure that the parts of society who at the moment feel disenfranchised are again brought in and enfranchised, so that they feel they have a say in what's going on, that they have enough money to meet their basic needs and a bit more, that they're not worrying about how they're going to pay for their children's further education, which in America is a whole other issue that I've talked about before. But by addressing that end of the problem, I think that one would see, or begin to see, a decrease in the amount of human trafficking and a decrease in the crimes being committed in the sex industry. So I would like to thank you all for watching this episode of 9, and good evening.